So we're going to speak for a little while and give kind of overview and some concepts. We will definitely leave time for Q&A, so you should feel free to submit questions. And then, of course, our contact information will be available. And so if you have any follow-up questions or suggestions, we're certainly available. And so these are going to be the issues that, based really on our long-standing experience working with companies and researchers just like you, trying to help them get them paid for their work, paid for their product, and make sure that patients have access to the products. So a couple of real overview takeaway lessons. So I wanted to actually begin at the end here, which is that sort of what I want you all to come away from this webinar with is sort of the following points. So first of all, from a reimbursement perspective, you need to have a comprehensive strategy. All of you, I'm sure, have, let's say, depending on where you are in your clinical development, you've got a capital raising strategy, you've got a regulatory strategy, you've got a research strategy. Well, in the same way, you need to have a reimbursement strategy. And just like you wouldn't start your regulatory strategy the day you decided to file an IND and start clinical trials, you have to think about your reimbursement strategy long before your product hits the market and you want insurance companies to pay for it. So you need to have a comprehensive strategy, and it's never too early to start thinking about that strategy, because the decisions that you're going to make will impact your ability to get reimbursement and vice versa. The reimbursement environment may influence your research and your product development agenda. The second point is that FDA approval is necessary, but it's not sufficient. At one point, it sort of was sufficient that if you were able to get on the market and demonstrate that you were safe and effective, pretty much an insurer would say you were medically necessary and they would cover your product. That is no longer true. Whether we're talking about Medicare and Medicaid or we're talking about private insurance, FDA approval is absolutely necessary in the vast majority of cases, but it's not enough. Payers want to see different information. They don't want to just see safety and efficacy like FDA does. They might want to see, for example, your clinical benefit compared to other products on the market. They might want to see pharmacoeconomic data to demonstrate that your product is actually cost effective. There's a lot of information that a payer wants to see that FDA may not care about. You also want to make sure you understand your product. I know this sounds simple, but really you need to really think about your product and where will it be used? Will it be used in the hospital? Will it be used in an outpatient setting? Will it be used in a physician office? Will it be a pill that a patient just takes, goes to the pharmacy and fills a prescription and takes it home? All of those questions, the answer to all of those questions have implications for reimbursement. What's the formulation of your product? Is it injectable, for example, or is it another kind of product? That will have an impact on reimbursement. What is your patient population? If you're talking about diseases affecting the elderly, and by the way, when I say elderly, I mean 65 and over, then you're in Medicare, and that has implications. If you're talking about children, well, that is Medicaid, and that's a whole different set of circumstances. You also have to learn the coding, coverage, and payment processes, decision makers, and timetables. We're going to go into that during this presentation, but the bottom line is coding, coverage, and payment processes they're related, but they're independent. The people who are making those decisions are often different, and they operate on different timetables. And all of those different timetables are different than your FDA timetable. So you really need to understand all of those processes, who the decision makers are, and under what timetables they're working. And we're going to talk about that in this webinar. And then, of course, you have to engage all those people. You have to engage the payers. You have to talk to them. You have to talk to the medical directors of the health plans. You have to talk to CMS about Medicare. You have to talk to physicians who are going to be using your product. You have to talk to patient advocacy groups who might be real allies for you. And, of course, you have to talk to policymakers. The last thing you want is for somebody in Congress to be holding hearings about how, for example, expensive all these new regenerative medicine products are. The way to mitigate that, concern is by talking to all of those people in advance. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. So starting to get into a little bit more detail, the way we like to say this is the best idea in the world is never going to get to a patient, which means, A, that's bad enough, and then B, it means you're not going to get paid, unless, of course, it's FDA approved. But Medicare, Medicaid, private health plans have covered the product or service, right? So that means that it's a covered benefit under somebody's insurance plan. That billing codes have been assigned, so doctors and hospitals will get paid for using your product, administering your product, et cetera. And, of course, that the payment rates for the product have been established. So even if you've got, this fantastic product, or you've discovered this fantastic molecule with fabulous properties, you're not going to get it to a patient, and it's not going to be paid for unless you meet all of these criteria. So another way to say this is that FDA approval is essential first step, but it's not the same as insurance coverage, and it doesn't guarantee a specific payment rate. So it does, just because you're approved does not mean you're going to be covered by a health plan or by Medicare or Medicaid, and it certainly doesn't mean that you're going to get paid a certain amount for that product. Okay, so once again, FDA, reimbursement are independent processes. They're related, of course, but they are independent with different decision makers. So the concepts that we're going to talk about, that I just talked about so far, and that we're going to be talking about today, are basically conceptually the same everywhere, in every developed nation. So let's say, Europe and Japan. I mean, they're conceptually the same. Conceptually, you're going to have to demonstrate that your product has significant clinical benefit, for example, et cetera. And, of course, there are differences. So, of course, there's an agency in the UK called NICE that specifically does cost-effectiveness analysis overtly, and Medicare does not. So, of course, there's differences in individual companies, in individual countries, but the concepts, the processes, the kinds of data you're going to have to gather, the kinds of information you need fundamentally are the same. And that is in keeping with the fact that the market for regenerative medicine is worldwide. So you're probably already thinking that, well, you want to sell your product in the U.S., but there might be reasons why you want to go after the European market as well. Or you might want to, go start in Europe and then come to the U.S. So the concepts that we're talking about here are absolutely relevant wherever you're going to go. And then I just wanted to, before I turn it over to Randy, who's going to sort of drill down on some of these concepts, I want to just elaborate a little bit on the reimbursement components that I mentioned. So I mentioned that there are three. There's coding, coverage, and payment. And you need to have all three if you're going to get paid, if you're going to get reimbursed. So what coding is it makes sure that the products and the services used or services administered, to use the product by a hospital, by a doctor, are identified. So you all know, because we've all been to the doctor and gotten that receipt from them that we bring over before we pay as we head out the door, or that we submit to insurance. There are codes for all of the procedures that a doctor is going to do. That means that if there's not a code for a doctor to administer your kind of product or your product, you're going to need to make sure a new code gets created. The same is true for hospitals. And the same is going to be true for you, because products also have codes. So you're going to want to make sure that there's a code for your product. So we'll talk about there's a whole coding process that you need to go through. And by the way, the people who run those processes, the CPT code is run, the doctor code is run by the doctors, the Medicare code, the product code is run by Medicare, et cetera. So it's all slightly different. Coverage, that's the determination that your product provides a clinical benefit and should be included for enrollees, right? So that again, we've heard all this in our own private lives about how, some experimental treatment might or might not be covered, or a particular, drug that you want or your kids need or something is covered. Same thing. You're going to want to make sure that the health plan, and again, Medicare, Medicaid, or a private plan, makes a decision to cover your product, that it can be included in the health plan for their enrollees. And then, of course, payment, how much the doctor and the hospital and your company are going to be paid. These are separate, though related processes. As I was saying, they have different decision makers, which we'll talk about in a second. So they have their own decision makers. They have their own timetable. All of them are different from FDA, but all of them are necessary in order for you to have a successful reimbursement strategy, in order for your product to be reimbursed and for you to make sure that patients are going to get access to your product, because doctors and hospitals are going to get paid for administering it or using it. So I'm going to now turn it over to Randy to do the next set of slides, and then I'll be back towards the end. So Randy, why don't you take over?
Okay, well, thank you, Michael, and good morning or good afternoon, depending upon which time zone you're in. I think the point has been clearly made that FDA approval is essential to get to market, but is insufficient to actually establish a market for you. And what I want to try to do is drill down on how to tell the difference and how to solve both problems of reimbursement strategy as well as FDA almost simultaneously. The important thing to remember when you're working with the FDA and you're designing clinical studies is that what the FDA wants to know when they're discussing clinical trial design is not always the same as what health plan medical directors will want answered. And the worst time to find out what the medical directors want answered is after you have been approved by the FDA, you've launched your product, and found out that nobody is paying for it. So it's very important to remember that distinction and to make sure that you're covering both sets of bases. A key element is always good science. The FDA wants good science to approve a product in their regulatory process, and the medical directors of insurance companies are looking at good science that's been published as they make their decisions and hunt for the information that they need in terms of the responsibilities they have to their companies and to their enrollees. And so I can't overemphasize the importance of having good science that has been peer-reviewed and is widely available to the various regulatory entities with which you're going to have to deal. This is not some people think that the reimbursement process, particularly when you're talking about a public program like Medicare or Medicaid, can be purely political. That is a role that sometimes happens, but ultimately, if the science is not there, the politics are not going to push a product into the market and make it successful. And this is a critical point that is often missed in company planning, and it's a significant barrier to market success. I have had clients who have called me a year after a product has been approved saying, nobody's paying for our product. And then I say, well, something simple like, well, what code do you use? And the response usually is, code? We need a code? And then we start solving the problem that should have been worked on probably 2 to 3 years before they ever called me. And typically at that point, the rates go up to try to catch them up in the whole system. So since we know that FDA approval is the essential first step, what we want to do is use the FDA process to help us build the basis for coverage and payment process. We know what the FDA wants us to find out because company representatives meet with the FDA. Your scientists are meeting with the FDA regularly. You're talking about the kinds of benchmarks that they want, what kind of study design they're looking for, the number of patients when you're in human studies, the length of time you're going to track these patients. So you're building a clinical information base right there as you're beginning these trials. That's when you can plug in the opportunity for answering health plan questions. Now, the health plans are a little different than FDA in that they're not sending you something or calling you into a meeting themselves saying, okay, here's what you need to be doing to make us happy. They're a little more passive. They'll sit back and wait. So you need to be aggressive. You need to be going forward and asking these key players at the health plans, typically the medical directors, what they will want to know to approve and provide coverage and ultimately payment for the product that FDA is now reviewing. So the idea of meeting, as Michael had said, meeting with people throughout this process from the very early days is extremely important. So how do we get it all right? Well, we get it right by figuring out, as I said, what the health plans want to know before FDA approves the product for marketing. And this goes to such things as the product's design and the FDA labeling, because those can be very influential in determining healthcare plan approval and the best payment, because payment differs by setting, by whether it's a pill or an injectable, as Michael alluded. And the decisions you're going to be making very early in the product design process are going to show up and have ramifications and implications in the marketplace for coverage and reimbursement. And so you need to think about, well, if I make this a pill that's going to be given to a patient through a drugstore on a prescription, that means I'm going to be in a prescription benefit situation, whether it's Medicare or it's a formulary for Medicaid. Is that the best place to be, both in terms of economics as well as in terms of patient availability, patient adherence to the regimen, et cetera? So you want to consider elements as fundamental as that early on, because they will affect what you get paid. Labeling. The way that FDA labels or regulates the label, approves the label, has a lot to do with what the insurance company is going to want to do in its own coverage policy, because they're going to look at the FDA labeling, and you may be asking for X, Y, and Z, and they're going to say, I'm sorry, there's nothing in the labeling on X, Y, and Z. We can't help you. So anticipate what you're going to want to do in the marketplace, what's going to happen in the real world with patients as you are considering labeling requirements and other things early in the process while you're talking with FDA about it, and say, okay, if I get this kind of labeling, what's that going to mean down the road for my patients or my customers and my success in the marketplace? I've seen, and I know Michael has seen the same thing, far too many good products get hung up because the FDA labeling was not well done, and it has created a noose around the neck of the product in terms of the size of the market. So, it's a very, very important area to work through and think about in terms of its ultimate impact on your market success. Again, let me reiterate, don't wait to ask all these questions until after the FDA has approved your product. These are all things that you want your team to be working on at the same time the FDA is doing its regulatory review. You should be working on your coding, coverage, and reimbursement strategies while you're waiting for the FDA to act. And a very important part of developing these strategies and moving them forward is to engage key third parties. Michael alluded to the importance of physicians and the specialty societies. They play a major role in coding determination. They play a major role in even acceptance of a product by the way they talk about it in their committee meetings. They play a major role in the way in which Medicare calculates a price for a new service or a product. So you need those alliances with physician organizations early on. You need key opinion leaders in the medical and scientific community. You know that already, but very often the key opinion leader is not the physician who is handling the coding committee in the specialty society. So while you need the doctor that everybody follows, if he or she says this is the best science, everyone moves that direction. But you're also going to need other people in the medical society who are very involved down in the weeds on coding and reimbursement issues to make sure that they are with you all the way. Because if they're not, you are pushing string uphill. And finally, patient advocacy groups. I have worked with patient advocacy groups for many, many years, and they can play an extremely important role in highlighting the importance of advances that you are working on, and in helping you quite ethically and properly promote the need for a product to be approved, for it to be covered, and for it to be reimbursed at a level that makes the new product benefit meaningful. To give you an example, I'm working right now with a client with CMS on a coverage decision, trying to change an old coverage policy and bring it up to date. There is a payment problem that has existed for years, so we're trying to solve that, because without solving the payment problem, the coverage policy is really, even if it says all the right things that we want, it really isn't going to work, because the reimbursement will not entice practitioners to make use of the product that my client manufactures and that I'm representing. So we are using patient advocacy groups to help push this process along to say, wait a minute, you've got to not only change the coverage so it's better for all of us who have the disease, but you've got to make sure that you're putting enough money behind the reimbursement so that the practitioners we see, whether it's a hospital-based physician or it's a private practice, so that those people don't have a financial disincentive from using the product. I mean, they're not going to want to lose money. So you can use groups like that extremely effectively in your overall planning and activity, and you can use them early. You don't have to wait until FDA is approving or has approved your drug. So let's look at what health plans want to know. And here's where we get into what I think are some of the different questions that FDA doesn't necessarily address. First thing that you're going to get asked is, how does your product, your new product, compare to the existing therapies, and how much is it going to cost? Because the private health plans, all health plans really, are very sensitive to price. We know that because of the cost of medical care. Private health plans can ask the questions much more explicitly than perhaps the Medicare coverage people, only because of the way the law works and the regulations assign responsibility in Medicare. But everybody wants to know what the cost is going to be. And what they're looking for when they're asking for comparison to existing therapies is, show us data that has been peer-reviewed that says what you're doing is better. If you have a breakthrough, that's wonderful, but make sure you've got really good science to back it up. If you've got good science and you've got a breakthrough, you can negotiate a much better situation in terms of payment than if you have weak data or just a marginal improvement over existing therapies. But this is going to be something you're going to be asked up front. They're going to say, is the clinical outcome for the patient better than, similar to, or current treatments? I had once put in this slide, or is it worse than current treatments, but I figured I might as well be more optimistic because if it's really better than the current therapies, or if there are no therapies, which is an even better situation for you to get into the market, then they're more inclined to provide coverage quickly. They're more inclined to help push the coding processes if those need to be engaged. And they're more inclined to talk to the people who have the money and encourage them to pay a rate that is somewhat related to what you think you'd like to get. Or is the treatment just sort of similar to current treatments? If it's a Me Too, expect to get paid and treated like the lowest common denominator in the array of products. Now, I know in the area of regenerative medicine, there's very little of that because it's a new science, very exciting science, and offers opportunities that may not exist clinically today, cures where no cures have been in place. But you're still going to have to persuade a skeptic called a medical director, and they all come out of the same gene pool, that your product is in fact that superior or does have a cure. Don't make a claim that you can't substantiate. One of the things that you'll be asked by insurance companies is the long-term effects of the product. The FDA may or may not have asked you to track patients for a long period of time. I remember a meeting I attended, first meeting I had with a client. We met with an Aetna medical director in Connecticut. And he opened the meeting, didn't say hello, didn't say anything else. He just said, can you give me your 4-year data? Well, the company hadn't even been in business 4 years, so the short answer was no. And the meeting went downhill from there. We ultimately turned it around and got where we wanted to be. But the point is, the insurance companies are looking for durability of therapeutic outcome. So if you're going to say, my product is a cure, they're going to say, okay, how long is it a cure? Is it an absolute cure forever and ever, or is it just delaying the onset of some other stage of the disease, perhaps pushing it back a few years? Not that that's not valuable, but they're going to want data that shows the kinds of claims you're going to need to make to prove superiority over other products. So if the FDA is only asking you, let's say, to track patients 6 months, go ahead and track those patients another 6 or maybe another 12 as that study goes forward, so that you can answer to the medical director, well, I may not have 4-year data, but I've been following the same patients for 1.5 years, and here's what we know. That's much more useful than saying, well, the FDA only asked us for 6 months, so here's the 6-month study. They're going to ask you for more than that unless we're talking about a miracle drug, in which case everybody will be so excited they'll cut through all of the system. These are particularly important points for the regenerative medicine products that are new. The science is not well understood by a lot of people who are medical directors because it is new. It's very sophisticated. And these products are potentially very high priced when compared to other therapies. So you want to make sure that you can justify the price you're going to be asking for. And the price's justification is not what your CFO has said you need to make to pay back the development costs. It's what the market is willing to reimburse you at. And we all know, as I said, about the pressures from the market to cut costs and reduce spending. So cost effectiveness data, some of the pharmacoeconomic data that Michael referenced earlier, these can be very, very important parts of your reimbursement plan. And one way of finding out what these key issues are very early is actually survey health plans. Talk to a number of medical directors. Analyze what they're doing now, what they're paying now. And that's going to give you a lot of valuable information for developing your own strategies for answering the questions that health plans want to know. I referred to cost effectiveness. Now, how does that work? Well, if you go into CMS and you talk to the coverage staff there, which is a very good thing to do if you're making a product that would be used by people over 65 at all, they're going to shy away from the cost effectiveness word, at least publicly. They may have it in the back of their minds, but theoretically and legally, they're not supposed to talk about those sorts of things. They are supposed to talk about clinical benefit. So if you have a meeting with CMS and you say, I've got this great cost-effectiveness study, they'll say, that's wonderful. Let's talk about the clinical benefit. Put your cost-effectiveness study away. Health plan medical directors on the private side have more flexibility because they don't operate under the same legal and regulatory restraints as CMS staff. They're liable to be much more direct about, well, how much do you think you're going to charge for this? Show me that what you're going to charge is justified by the extraordinary value to the patient that you're going to produce, and I should recommend to my Blue Cross Blue Shield or Aetna or whomever that we need to pay the cost of this particular drug. Now, everybody understands it costs money to develop these products, and particularly where you're in areas of new science, it's not at all cheap to develop new products, but they are very concerned that they're just not paying for the poor financial decisions of the business or a financial plan that was created out of thin air by people who never even looked at the realities of the marketplace and insurance company cost containment, et cetera, et cetera. So what you want to be able to do, whether it's apparent from CMS or not, you want to be able to demonstrate value and cost effectiveness, especially compared to existing treatments. If there's no therapy at all, if you are completely novel, you can actually get away with a lot more things with less information because there is no alternative. And if you show some improvement for a patient that where there is otherwise no hope, you're much more likely to get coverage and a reasonable payment because you're novel and because the people listening to you have some sense of sympathy for the people who are suffering from the disease and have no hope, and you're now in a position to give them some hope. That can buy you a lot. But remember, the market is crowded with things, whether it's surgery or medicine, to treat all kinds of things, diseases and conditions. And so you may be coming in and trying to shove something out of the way because you are so much more effective. Well, they're going to be, the medical director will be very aware of the alternate therapies and their success. And paying you $50,000 a treatment when they're paying $10,000 a treatment for, let's say, for surgery that is successful, you've got to make a strong case why it is in the patient's benefit, it's in the system-wide benefit to move from a $10,000 surgical procedure to a $50,000 drug therapy. If you're going to be able to persuade Medicare or any other health plan that they should incorporate your product into their covered benefit structure at or near the price you want to get paid. And also, when you're dealing with the insurance plans, make sure that you're showing value in an area they really care about. And this is not always clear, but let me use one example of a client that Michael and I had worked with. They wanted very much to talk to Medicare and explain how important their drug was going to be or their product was going to be, but they had included no Medicare beneficiaries in any of their clinical trials. So Medicare didn't care what they had, because as far as Medicare was concerned, they had no way, they had not established a benefit for the people that Medicare cares about, who are the over 65 and disabled communities or end-stage renal disease. So, that's just one example of not thinking about what the payer cares about and having it come back and be a problem. So when you are thinking about these things, make sure that you show value in an area that somebody really cares about on the payment side. Okay, Michael had referenced in the beginning codes. Well, why are they important and what do they do? Codes describe healthcare products and services so a payment can be made. Basically, everything is done by computer. The computers have to be able to recognize something, and the codes, whether they're numeric or they're alphanumeric, are the way that you get a computer to recognize what you've done and get paid. They also become the basis of bundled payments, such as the hospital DRG payments under Medicare. If you don't have codes, things can't get recognized and ultimately incorporated in cost reports and finally recorded in the bundled payment. So what kind of codes do you need when we talk about that? For a medical procedure, something a physician or a nurse practitioner or a podiatrist is going to do, you need a CPT code. That's current procedural terminology. For drugs, devices, other medical products, you need what's called a HCPCS Level 2 code. That's Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System. Everybody else calls it HCPCS because nobody can remember the real name. And these are codes that are called, you'll see them G codes, J codes, C codes. If you want to get your product paid for independently out and it's not in a prescription benefit arena, then you're going to need a HCPCS code that uniquely describes your product. So there are processes for getting these codes, which I'll touch on momentarily. The CPT is governed by the American Medical Association. The AMA staffs what's called the CPT editorial panel, which is sort of the Supreme Court of coding. The medical specialty societies are all involved in that. They review applications and express interest or dismay or disinterest. So your relationships with leaders in physician specialty societies is very, very key. And again, it's not just the scientific people that you're accustomed to working with, the leading scientists in oncology or dermatology or some other field. It's the people in the society who are doing the coding and reimbursement side of things, people that you might normally not be dealing with in your day-to-day work and relationships with these societies. You need to get to know the other side of the medical society, both AMA as well as the specialties where your product that will use the product you're ultimately trying to take to market. That could be oncology, it could be rheumatology, it could be a variety of different specialties, could be a combination of specialties, but you need to have relationships not just with the scientific people, but also with the coding and reimbursement ones. The HCPCS code process is governed by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So there, you're taking an application to a panel that is primarily made up of their staff, but again, the medical societies do play a role in supporting your request for the HCPCS code, and if they are completely uninterested in commenting on it or hostile to it, that's going to hurt you when CMS considers whether or not to give you the code they want. So let me turn to why we have codes and what we use them for, and that's to get payment. They are essential to proper payment, as I indicated. If you can't get a code that's specific to your product, you're going to wind up with what's called a miscellaneous code, which is just a bucket of junk. And that means that when the claim comes in, it gets set aside, goes on somebody's desk. They may or may not look at it quickly. They're likely to turn down a miscellaneous code claim and make the doctor or the hospital appeal it. All of that is a complete pain, waste of money, and is not going to help you in the marketplace. So getting codes that are miscellaneous codes is really just a non-starter. You want things that are specific to what you have produced or what your product does. But even if you have a code that is on point, health plans are not inclined to pay what you charge. The medical services, this is especially true of Medicare, but is increasingly true of private health plans, are being paid on the basis of a fee schedule. Good example in Medicare is the physician fee schedule, which every service a doctor performs has a specified rate. It's determined in advance, published. That's everybody knows what they're going to get paid if they do X, if they do an infusion, if they do an injection, if they do a heart operation, or they pay on the basis of a bundled rate. That's typically what you see at the hospital level. For Medicare, it's the DRGs on the inpatient side. That's diagnosis-related group, where they have bundled together all the services that are determined to be required for a given diagnosis, and Medicare has determined what it will pay for that DRG. They don't pay necessarily for the hospital to make money off of every DRG. In fact, they expect that for some patients, the patient cost will be below the payment, so there'll be a profit. But in other cases, the patient cost will be above the payment, so there will be a loss. But at the end of the year, it's expected in a normal population that this will balance out. Obviously, hospitals have incentives to try to manipulate the use of the DRGs and their patients in a way that maximizes reimbursement and minimizes loss. Physicians are in a somewhat different situation because they're still in a fee-for-service, even though the fee has been determined in advance and they have no real control over the amount per unit. The site of service is an important factor in overall payment policy. So as you're doing your drug development, somebody needs to be thinking about where is this going to be used. Michael referred to some of that. If it's going to be used for hospital inpatients, you know that the cost of your product is going to be buried into a bundle with a whole lot of other things. And when the product comes onto the market, the system is slow to accommodate new products, particularly expensive new products, and so there is resistance from hospitals to take on something that's new and expensive, knowing that the lag time for having things catch up. So it's going to be very, very important as you consider pricing, as you consider marketing, that you look at where this is used. If it's used in the hospital outpatient department, again, under Medicare, that's a bundled service or a bundled payment for a number of services. There are some special considerations in the outpatient side that may be beneficial. You may even want to design your drug for treatment in the outpatient department because you'll find that the Medicare rate is more generous than it might be if it's buried into the bundled DRG. These are decisions that you can analyze early and can help guide the way in which you develop a product, test a product, and so on. The level of payment is very much influenced by where your product is used. For example, if it's the product is used in a physician's office, like a lot of oncology is used in clinics and physician office settings. There, the payment is determined on average sale price, which is information that you, the company, have to give to the government or to the insurance plan, and the physician is getting a 6% handling fee. So that's a different kind of payment in a different setting than, or a different situation rather than you'd have in the hospital inpatient or outpatient department. So as you look at how you would develop a market, how you would succeed financially in the market, you've got to consider where is this going to be used, because that's going to determine in many ways the level of payment that you can reasonably expect to get back from your customers when they purchase the product, or how much resistance you may get from your customers when they look at the cost to them and their inability to recapture the cost. Michael also referenced in his beginning comments coverage. You can have a payment worked out, you can have codes worked out, you can have FDA approval worked out, and you can still have an insurance company that says, we're not going to cover your product as part of our benefit structure. And that could be a private or CMS. It's the key step to making sure that the health plan is actually going to pay someone for using the product or providing the service. And it's one that's often assumed. As Michael said, there was a time when you could safely assume this. That is no longer the case. So you cannot assume that coverage is immediately going to follow these other events that I described. Now, Medicare has a formal coverage process. You can go on the CMS website and see exactly how they do it, the kinds of questions they ask, the public comment they invite, so forth and so on. And typically, most coverage decisions in Medicare are made at the local contractor level. There are 12 to 15 different contractors around the country who make these decisions, and they use advisory panels of physicians, of specialists to help make those decisions. Private insurance plans also use typically physician panels to help them evaluate new technologies. That can be a very formal process. For example, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association has a technology assessment group in Chicago that the various plans can refer questions to, and they do a very rigorous analysis of new products, new services, before to help their plans determine whether or not coverage is going to be provided, and if so, on what terms. There are also some private companies that do this as well, and most of the insurance companies, private insurance companies, and the Medicare folks in coverage subscribe to those services as well. A company like Hayes, for example, just to have the information that they would need to be able to make the decisions. And the coverage decisions typically are made on the best available science. So if you don't have good science, it means that you're unlikely to get good coverage and good payment. It goes back to the beginning, which is good science is the basis for everything. With that, let me turn it back over to Michael to talk about things that are changing as we speak that will have an impact on the entire reimbursement process. Michael?
Thanks, Randy. And so you notice we sort of started general. We got into the weeds a little bit. I'm going to go back up a little general and just wrap up with a couple of key points, which is that in addition to all of the very specific things that we just talked about in terms of, you need to make sure there's a specific code and your product is covered and all of those things, all of these decisions that are going to be made by payers and all of this work that you're doing is within a environment that is changing very dramatically over the last several years, and it will continue. And all of these changes really are designed to reduce spending on drugs. and other things too, but they certainly impact spending on drugs. And so this is the environment in which you are operating. And so it's the reason that, I started out by talking about a comprehensive strategy, because in addition to let's call it the specific nuts and bolts about engaging payers and getting codes, you also have to be cognizant of these system changes, and you also have to factor those into your strategy. So you now have the federal government, as well as other organizations, spending billions of dollars to do comparative effectiveness modeling and studies. You have the creation of accountable care organizations from the Affordable Care Act, which of course are mechanisms for doctors and hospitals to join together and be reimbursed by Medicare, but then provide a whole suite of services under that reimbursement. Similarly, you have Medicare bundling more and more payments, where the program is saying, we're going to pay X amount of dollars to take care of a stroke patient, let's say, and it's up to the providers and to the physicians to figure out the best way to do it. Those are going to be particularly challenging when you consider that regenerative medicine products could be expensive. So how do we make sure that an expensive product could fit into that payment bundle? How do we make sure that an accountable care organization understands the clinical benefit and the value of a regenerative medicine product, and they see that while there might be some costs on the front end, it actually might reduce hospitalizations, for example, on the back end, which is what they're trying to do to save money. Health plan formularies tier new products to make sure that they spend less, frankly. So all of these are significant. You need to be demonstrating clinical benefit and value in a way that matters. We've talked about that earlier in this presentation, but this is just another kind of way that manifests itself. It's also the reason you need to be talking to CMS, you need to be talking to Congress and other people in Washington who are right now trying to figure out how to change these policies going forward. So you need to make sure that they understand what you're doing and why it's important, so that they don't sort of inadvertently knock you out of the system. We talked also about patient groups. This is another opportunity to engage patient groups to ensure there's a demand for innovation and to make sure that your products remain a viable part of the healthcare system. So finally, kind of wrapping up, so basically we're talking about you need to have the right data for coverage. It's a function of having the good clinical studies, as Randy talked about, published in the peer-reviewed literature. Certainly a preference for U.S. literature, though not exclusively. You really want to be collecting all this information during your clinical trials, so that, Randy raised the point of a client where they said at the end, oh my God, what do you mean we need a code? Well, that's why you need to be starting this early. That's why you need to be gathering this information now, so you don't have to go out and do additional studies for reimbursement purposes. So figure out what you need for coding and coverage, build that data into your process. When you're ready to roll out your product and everything is great and you're going to be approved by the FDA, you need to come to Washington and educate Congress and the policy environment about your product, so that they help you when you're working with CMS and Medicare, and they help you with ACOs, and they make sure that there's sort of a public, not just acceptance, but welcoming of your new product. The last thing you want, as I said, is a congressional hearing about how expensive your product is. You want all of these folks in Congress and elsewhere to be your advocates with payers and others in the healthcare system. So in conclusion, get a strategy, get it together early. That's the most important thing. It has to be comprehensive. It has to deal with coding, coverage, and payment. It has to deal with doctors and patients and Congress and CMS. The reimbursement process has its own timeline. You want to find out what health plans want to know. You want to understand how your product will be used. You need to understand the impact of health system changes, and you need to build relationships with stakeholders like physicians, patients, and folks in Washington. So we'll stop there with our formal presentation. I know we're right up against 2 o'clock, which I know was the cutoff time, but I'd like to take a question or two because people have been patient. So I got one which says that how do you engage payers in discussions if your clinical trials are still ongoing? So that's a very practical question. Basically, you want to start talking to the medical directors so they start hearing about your product, educating them about your product, seeing whatever preliminary data you have, what data you hope to have if you're in, say, phase 1 or phase 2, and especially so that you can plan your phase 3 trial accordingly. Randy, do you have anything you want to add to that? Any more specifics?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add is it's a very good time to ask the medical director, what do you want to know? And especially when you're dealing with novel therapies, novel science, they're going to have a lot of questions in their own mind, and hopefully they will share that with you. You can build the responses into your studies.
We also got a question asking about the fact that some regenerative medicine products might be just sort of one treatment and then a cure, let's say, as opposed to a traditional, let's call it a traditional drug, or what we've seen before from drugs, or biologics, which require kind of chronic management and ongoing treatment. The question is sort of how do you approach CMS about that? So, Randy, you want to take first crack, and then I'll finish up?
Sure. This goes back to the point I was making earlier, and that is where you have a true breakthrough, something that is really different and novel from either no therapies being available or current therapies. You can price it at a level that might be well above what comparable therapies are getting, because you have such a novel opportunity for the patient. The key is proving that through good scientific data. And it's not a cure that lasts a week, it's a cure. Or it extends life 10 years, whatever it is. You've got to be able to back the claim. Once you can do that, once you have the data that does that, you can make the demand for the higher payment because you can show this is something patients have never had, and it's far more cost-effective to do it this way than the way we're treating these people today.
Yeah, and I would add that, sort of the more expensive you want to price your product, the higher the scrutiny, let's say, the health plans are going to give you in terms of the clinical benefit that they're going to want to see. And so, if you want to be in that situation, as Randy said, you're going to have to really demonstrate, some serious, butt-kicking clinical data that's going to show that you're changing the game for patients who otherwise had no options. Perhaps it's a fatal disease, or perhaps it's a super expensive disease that patients live for a long time and are always in and out of the hospital or whatever. So if you can bring that to the table, they're going to insist on that because they get it, that you're going to be asking a lot. On the other hand, the flip side of that is if you do have that kind of data, then you have more options in terms of what the health plans are going to allow. They will, it is likely, though, that they will, part of that data, as Randy was saying, part of that data may have to be kind of long-term clinical benefit. So you'd have to anticipate that they would say something like, that looks great, and I get that, your patients, you treated these patients 6 months ago, and by all the surrogates and the biomarkers and everything, it looks like the patient is cured. But what if it comes back? What if what if the disease comes back in a year? Then what? So you just have to sort of be anticipating those kinds of questions. So I have to say that it's about 10 after 2, and I'm getting the hook here. So I really, before I turn it back over to Mike for final announcements, thank you all so very, very much for being with us this afternoon and this morning. We have our contact information up on the slide. As you heard, these slides will be posted on the CIRM website. Please don't hesitate to give us a call or drop us a line if you have any further questions. So thanks very much. Mike, back to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar for today. At this time, you may now disconnect. Thank you very much for joining us.